Well, turn in your Bible, if you would, to Mark chapter 14 this evening. Mark chapter 14, we'll be picking up in verse 43 for our text. In last week's lesson, we saw how Jesus led his disciples to a familiar spot on the Mount of Olives where they regularly gathered to pray at the Garden of Gethsemane. On the way there, Jesus informed them that they would be scattered, that they would abandon him in his hour of need. Of course, Peter speaks up and takes the lead and denies this claim, and Jesus explained that not only will you flee and abandon me, but you will deny me 3 times this very evening. And while he didn't say that about the others, he certainly said that they would all flee, that they would all depart, that they would be offended because of Christ. And the whole group of them just proclaimed their faithfulness, proclaimed their dedication to the Lord, and they all said, "You're wrong, Jesus. We're not going to depart. We're not going to abandon you. We're not going to leave you." When they get to the garden, of course, Jesus enters in with the disciples. He leaves a group of them in one spot. He takes Peter and James and John a little bit further into the orchard, the area there. And then he has them stay and wait, and he goes a little distance further than that. He begins to pray. And he prays for an extended period of time. It says an hour. I don't know if it was exactly an hour or if that's just a general approximation, but it was an extended period of time, and during that time the disciples all fall asleep. They're unable to stay vigilant and pay attention to what's going on, and he comes back and he rebukes them and challenges them to stay awake, to watch, and to pray because they were going to face some trials, just like Jesus was about to face a very severe test. He leaves, and then he comes back after a little while later. They're asleep once again, repeats the process. He goes back, prays a third time, and he comes once again to find them asleep. This time he doesn't wake them and tell them to pray anymore because it's time. The time is at hand, and we finished up there in verse 42 where Jesus says, "Rise up, let us go. He that betrayeth me is at hand." And so that's where we pick it up this evening as these events begin to unfold just as Jesus had seen coming. So Mark chapter 14, verse 33, the Bible says, "And immediately while he yet spake, cometh Judas, one of the 12, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders." And so as Jesus was speaking these words, rousing the disciples from their sleep and warning them what was upon them, Jesus leads this crowd into the garden to complete his betrayal of the Lord. He had made these arrangements beforehand as he went to the chief priests and arranged to betray Jesus for some amount of money. It ended up being 30 pieces of silver. And so he begins to bring this process to pass. He shows up and he begins this deception or this betrayal of Jesus Christ. Judas is specifically described as one of the 12. This is something that you see a lot as he's mentioned throughout the Gospels. It really highlights that fact that he was part of the group, right? He was one of the 12. He was one of those who were closest to Jesus, one of those who were with him the most. Now that doesn't, just because he was there in the midst, it doesn't mean though that he was a believer, that he was genuine, that he was real. He was the fake of the bunch, right? He was the one who was the imposter in a lot of ways, and yet Jesus knew this from the very beginning. Jesus knew that he would be the one that betrayed him. He knew all these things, and yet he still chose him so that these things might come to pass as they had to come to pass. Not only was Judas sending an innocent man to his death, not only was he doing it because of his pride and greed, but he was also acting as a traitor, which to most people in societies is viewed as one of the most unfavorable ways, right? That's one of the worst things that you can be as a traitor. Nobody likes a traitor, and for the Jews that was certainly the case, and it was something that was very important to them. That's why, at least one of the reasons why they detested the publicans so much, right? They viewed the publicans as traitors. They were working for Rome. They were doing Rome's work, and Rome was the hated enemy. But who was hated more than Rome? Probably the publicans. Not only the publicans, the Samaritans is another group that was very hated by the Jews. And why was that? Well, it was because they viewed them as traitors, right? You went out and you intermingled with the Gentile people, and so you've betrayed the trust that you had. You've betrayed the commandments that God has given you. And so they viewed them as traitors, which was something that was terrible. And that mindset, that idea is really emphasized as we talk about Judas, and it talks about him being one of the 12 so many times. It just highlights the treachery that was involved in what he was doing here in turning against Jesus. Now, accompanying Judas, there was this large crowd, a large assembly. It was made up of temple guards, Roman soldiers probably accompanied them, representatives of those Jewish leaders that it mentioned, the chief priests and scribes were part of this. That was the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of the Jews, and so they would have sent not only the guards to arrest them, they would have sent some of their own people as well to make sure everything was done right. And probably accompanying all that was a large group of just regular people, or maybe some unsavory sorts of people like the ones that they would eventually use to accuse Jesus and bring false testimonies against him later on. And so you've got a large number of people who are coming out, and we know what happens when large groups of people get on a mission like this, and he describes them as having spears and swords, and so they come out armed. John tells us that they had torches, and you can just kind of get a picture in your mind of this crowd of people marching down the street and heading off to do this deed, with Judas right out there in the lead trying to bring them all along to what's going to happen. As one commentary put it, the Gentiles and Jews were united in the daring act of arresting the Son of God. The Gentiles and the Jews didn't get along on much, and they didn't agree on much, but here we see that they would both have a part in bringing Jesus to trial, as false and unjust as that trial would be. In verse 44, we see the means by which Judas would betray the Lord to those who would arrest him. Verse 44 says, "And he that betrayed him had given them a token, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, the same is he. Take him and lead him away safely." So while Jesus was fairly well known at this point, of course, for his miracles and all that he had done, and especially even in Jerusalem, as he had been teaching recently in the temple and gained a lot of notoriety, a lot of eyes were upon him, and so a lot of people would know who he was. That doesn't necessarily mean that the temple guards would be able to identify him in this crowd of people. Also, if there were Roman soldiers involved here, they certainly weren't likely to know who Jesus was or wouldn't have any experience with Jewish matters in that way. And so they needed somebody to positively identify Jesus, and Judas obviously was the one to do that. He was very familiar with the entire group, and so he'd be able to quickly figure out who Jesus was, where he was, and what was going on there. At this late hour, and by this time it would have been very late in the night. They've already had the Passover, which that began at 6 o'clock. They had the Passover. They observed the Lord's Supper. They sang the hymn. They walked to the Mount of Olives, where Jesus brought this lesson. They've been praying possibly for 3 hours or so. And so we're talking fairly late into the evening, the nighttime here, where this is all going on. So it's dark. Now, it would have been a full moon because of when the Passover happens, it's a full moon, and that's because of the lunar calendar and all those things. And so there would have been some light from that, but you know how it is if you're in an orchard or in a grove of trees, it's going to be dark. There's going to be all kinds of shadows and stuff. And so they needed somebody to say, this is Jesus. If you go in and you accidentally grab Peter instead of Jesus and Jesus gets away, then you're in a lot of trouble, right? Because then not only do you have the wrong guy, but who you're looking for, everybody knows what's going on, and that leads to all kinds of other headaches for them to deal with. And so they wanted to be sure to get Jesus, and Judas was more than happy to fill that role and to do his part in betraying the Lord. You see his insistence there that they catch him and take him away safely. Now, safely doesn't mean without getting hurt, okay? This doesn't mean that Judas was concerned about the well-being of Jesus. He's basically saying make sure you secure him. Make sure that you have good hold of him. Make sure he doesn't get away. And that speaks a little bit to the greed, the only concern that Judas seems to have in this matter. He wanted to make sure and get his blood money. He wanted to make sure that nothing went wrong as far as that was concerned. So he wants to ensure that Jesus is apprehended and that he doesn't get away, or that there's not any problems or trouble that comes as a result. Now, again, being very familiar with the disciples, he knew that there were ones like Peter, who's a little bit impulsive, I guess you could say. He also knew that there were some like James and John, the sons of thunder. They were always happy to stick it to the Romans, or stick it to those in authority. So Judas knew, there might be some trouble with this group of people. I know them well enough to know that they have a dear love for Christ, that they care deeply about him, and so they may try to cause some trouble. And so he wants to ensure that this goes quickly and smoothly without any difficulties or complications there. Initially, everything does just that. Verse 45 It says, and as soon as he was come, he goeth straightway to him, and saith, Master, Master, and kissed him. And they laid their hands on him and took him. So Judas comes to Jesus. He addresses him as if he were a faithful follower. Master, Master, or Rabbi is probably the actual term that was used there, teacher. And so, again, it's this endearing term that a follower would use for his master. And so it just kind of deepens that betrayal, deepens that deception that he comes bringing. And then he gives him that kiss of friendship, right? A kiss of love, and yet it's a betrayal, a complete betrayal of Jesus Christ. And so John includes another detail here where Jesus, when they come to approach him, Jesus says, Whom seek ye? When he says that, the whole crowd is forced back and knocked down to their knees. Just imagine the power that's there in the word of Christ. He just spoke, and he wasn't trying to hurt anybody or anything like that. If he had been, then they would have all been hurt. But it showed the power that he had and the reality that he was allowing these things to come to pass. This wasn't they're forcing this upon him, they're taking him away, and he doesn't have any say. Everything that happened was completely within his control, and he could have stopped it at any moment, and yet he willingly allowed this to take place. He allowed Judas to come to speak the words, to kiss him, and as a result, of course, Jesus allowed himself to be taken into custody by these guards, and that's when Peter attempts to rescue Jesus from the mob that's come to take him away, verse 47. And one of them that stood by drew a sword and smote a servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And so here you see the fisherman at his best, right, wielding a sword. And apparently he's not real good at it because all he could get was the guy's ear. He wasn't able to land a blow that would really hurt him. Now, that would really hurt, don't get me wrong. But it wouldn't, it's not a fatal wound or anything along those lines. Of course, this doesn't say it was Peter specifically. From John's account, we do know that it was Peter. John identifies him positively. He also identifies the servant, Malchus, I believe was his name. And Luke tells us that Jesus did indeed heal this servant. Okay, Jesus didn't just let him go without an ear. He took care of that, healed the servant, and he also explained to Peter, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. That's not recorded here in Mark, but from the other Gospels we can piece all those things together. What we do know here is that Jesus did not allow that to continue, and this brief moment of rebellion from Peter was really the only resistance that took place. And I think it shows us again a little bit about Peter. I think he was genuine in his desire to serve. He was genuine in his desire to defend the Lord, and I think he was genuine, as I said last time, about his claim that, Lord, I will die for you. If that's what it takes, I'll be right here beside you. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not going to turn away. The problem was that Peter wanted to do it his way. He wanted to offer his life in a way that he felt was right when it came to protecting the Lord. He didn't want to just take things as they came. He wanted to take matters into his own hands. But that's not what Jesus was going to do. Jesus was going to go peacefully. Jesus was going to submit himself to all these horrors that we're going to follow this evening, all the false trials, all the accusations, all the suffering. He was going to submit to those things. And Peter, I think he would have gladly died with Jesus with the sword in his hand, fighting off the enemy as best he could. It probably wouldn't have taken very long because you had, the temple guards and trained soldiers there who wouldn't have had any problem subduing the disciples of Jesus. But that wasn't Jesus' plan. And so when push comes to shove, if Peter wasn't able to do it his way and fight back in that manner, he seems to have kind of left the idea of dying for Jesus behind, as all the rest of them did. As we know, verses 48 and 49, we continue on. It says, "And Jesus answered and said unto them, Are you come out as against a thief with swords and staves to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and ye took me not. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." So as Jesus takes care of Peter and makes sure he's not causing any more trouble here, he heals the priest servant. He speaks to him and he says, "Why do you come at me in this way? Why do you come out as if I'm some scoundrel, as if I'm some rogue who might go do something crazy?" He says, "Look, I was with you, and very recently, over the past week, right, Jesus was there in the temple, and he was preaching and teaching, and what he's saying is, look, if I've done anything wrong, if there was any reason to arrest me, why didn't you do it then? I wasn't hiding from you. I wasn't, doing these things in secret. I was out and everybody knew that I was there. Everybody knew that I was teaching. So why didn't you take me then? Why do you wait till now under the cover of night at an inappropriate time, being the Passover evening? Nothing that they did here was the right manner in which to do it. And so he challenges them on those things, and he confronts them with those realities of what's going on here. Why didn't you take me if I had done anything wrong? And of course the answer is that he hadn't done anything wrong. There was no reason to arrest Jesus. There was no reason for this group to come against him. And yet that didn't stop them, because their desire was to bring destruction, was to destroy the ministry and the life of Jesus. And of course this was somewhat of a rhetorical question or statement, because he knew why these things were coming to pass. Ultimately, is so that the scriptures would be fulfilled. The scriptures like Psalm 41 verse 9, where the betrayal of David by a trusted advisor foreshadows the betrayal of Jesus by Judas. Over in Psalm 41 verse 9, the Bible says, "Yea, mine own familiar friend in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me." That's what Judas did. He was one of the 12. He was one of the close followers of Jesus as far as proximity, I guess, and time with him, and yet he betrayed him. He raised up his heel against him. Another is in Zechariah 13:7, which we looked at a few weeks ago, and Jesus referenced back in verse 27 when he explained to the disciples how they would be scattered. He said, "You'll be a sheep without a shepherd." That's a prophecy that was spoken of Christ, of the Messiah, and that would be fulfilled in the very next verse, verse 50. There in our text it says, "And they all forsook him and fled." Again, in a sense, Peter was willing to die for the Lord if he could do it his way, but he didn't want to go down without a fight. He didn't want to go down in submission, but that's exactly how Jesus was going to be treated. That's how he was going to allow himself to go as that willing sacrifice, as the one who would take away the sins of the world. He did it willingly, and Peter wasn't willing to do that. He wasn't willing to submit in that way. So Peter and all the rest, they forsake Jesus, they flee. In direct contradiction to the promise that they made earlier, right? Those words, those bold words, rebuking Jesus, basically saying, "Oh no, we're not going to forsake you. We're not going to be offended by you." That all changes here when push comes to shove and the moment comes to hand, and they all flee. They all try to get away and succeed in getting away from this crowd of people who had come to take Jesus captive. Then in the next couple of verses, we have an unusual account that's unique to the Gospel of Mark. We've seen a lot of things that are unique to Mark's Gospel, but this is one that is kind of unusual. Verse 51 says, "And there followed him a certain young man having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And the young men laid hold on him. And he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked." Now you'd think, is this some part of a bigger story? Is this something that's going on that we'll find out more about? And really it's not. It's just a really brief account of something that happened that evening to some young man. Now, Mark doesn't identify him again positively, and since none of the other Gospels say anything about this particular event or this encounter, it leaves us to wonder who is it and why did Mark include this in this account. We'll start with that second question first. Some say it just signifies how confusing of a night it was and how chaotic the evening was, where this person who apparently had no direct connection with Jesus, at least as far as he wasn't there praying with them or part of the 12, how he was almost taken and arrested along with Jesus, but he narrowly manages to escape. The other thing, which I tend to think is, well, I do think is the actual answer, is that I think that this was Mark, and so this verifies that this is an eyewitness account. These are the things that Mark saw that evening as following the Passover, possibly, and I think likely, as this crowd was moving toward the Garden of Gethsemane. Mark was probably at home in his bed. He hears the crowd and he follows them to see what's going on, to see what's about to take place. He shows up on the scene along with the crowd, not as part of the crowd, but just to see what's going on. And in the commotion that's going on, somebody grabs him by the arm and decides, well, we're going to take you in with them. And you think, well, why didn't they grab the disciples? Well, one reason for that would be that there was a lot of confusion. Again, you've got this huge crowd of people. You've got people who are going to be loyal to Jesus, probably in the vast minority, but you'll have some. You'll have a whole lot of people who are against him. You'll have probably a lot of people who are just there to see a show, to see what's going on. And so you've got all this going on. It is nighttime, and while it was a full moon and you could see some things, you know how it is when it's shadowy and all that. There's confusion. Anything outside of the torchlight would, it'd be hard to identify or see. And so they were able to escape. This young man, like I said, I believe it's Mark, he was also able to escape. He shows up, having followed the crowd. If he did, get up from bed, he just kind of wraps himself in whatever was handy, and he follows them to see what's going on. They reach for him. Maybe somebody could identify him as being a follower of Christ or being associated with him. Maybe not, but they try to apprehend him, and he leaves the cloak that they had grabbed and just takes off and runs off into the night. Kind of a really peculiar story. And the other question is, well, why didn't Mark say it was Mark if it was him, right? And the answer is that typically wasn't the way that these writers would do it. John in his gospel very rarely references himself. He regularly talks about the disciple that Jesus loved. That was John, but he didn't identify himself. I don't know if it's a form of humility or just the style of writing that they did. But it wasn't uncommon for that to be the case. And so it wouldn't be uncommon for Mark to just say there was this young man, because he would have been a young man at that time. And this is what happened to him. I think it's a personal account, mainly based on the details. Who else would remember that, right? Out of all the things that go on that evening, who would remember this kid almost getting arrested and taken off in the night? And so that's my 2 cents. Other ideas about who it was, some suppose it was the owner of the vineyard or the garden, not vineyard, the orchard, and that he was there and almost got apprehended for, conspiring with Jesus or whatever. Some say it was Lazarus. I don't know why they say that, but some say it was Lazarus or one of the half-brothers of Jesus. There's a lot of speculation. Again, it doesn't say specifically. I think Mark is probably the best guess there and makes the most sense as far as why it's included and the meaning of it, because it would identify him as an eyewitness to these events, and it also gives a little bit about his personal account of what went on that evening. So we're going to wrap it up there for this evening. Next week we'll get into the trial, which is in the following verses. The first trial that Jesus faces before the council. This is a council of the Jewish leaders, the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, the Sanhedrin. And so he'll stand before them, and of course nobody's interested in a fair trial. And so Jesus isn't going to get that. We know that for sure, but we'll see what happens in this first trial. Of course, we know that leads to many other things that evening. So any questions or comments on what we studied this evening?